She leased the old barn for $900, expecting nothing more than rats, rust, and maybe some solitude. But when she pulled back the rotted tarp, the nose of a rusted P-51 Mustang stared back at her like a memory trying to breathe. What began as a mechanic's quiet escape became a restoration of love, legacy, and a war hero's final request. Some aircraft are retired, this one had simply been waiting. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, ones that blend history, heartbreak, and healing, tap that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story might just fly even higher than this one. It wasn't the barn that caught her attention. It was the way the wind moved through the dying wheat, how it hissed softly, like an engine cooling down after flight. Riley Monroe had been driving west, her old Chevy full of tools and a folding cot, when she passed the "For Lease" sign duct, taped to a rusted fence post. It was the kind of place you forget even exists too far from town to be useful, too close to the past to feel new. The barn slumped like a tired man, its roof buckled in places. Red paint faded to the color of dried blood. But Riley, 29, with more engine grease in her veins than most men twice her age, didn't flinch. She parked, stepped out, and stared for a long time before pulling the number off the sign and calling it. By nightfall, the barn was hers, 1-month lease, $900 flat. No paperwork, just a handshake from a man named Cliff, who smelled like diesel and defeat. The next morning, she showed up with a generator, a broom, and zero expectations. Just space, that's all she wanted. A place to breathe after everything that fell apart back in Tulsa. The first few hours were spent sweeping hay and broken glass. Birds fluttered out of the rafters. Sunlight poured through slats in the walls like stage lights. She kicked aside a toppled workbench and started clearing toward the back. That's when she saw it, just a sliver at first. A rounded metal edge, dulled by dust and time, peeking out beneath a gray tarp torn down the middle. She froze. Mechanics know the difference between junk and something sleeping. Her hands, blackened with barn soot, moved without her thinking. She gripped the tarp and pulled. It unfurled in a breathless second, revealing the nose of a World War II fighter plane, a P-51 Mustang, or what was left of one. The skin was oxidized and pitted. The red ring around the intake was chipped to metal. The propeller was gone. One wing dragged like a broken limb, the landing gear sunk half an inch into the hay-packed dirt. And yet, something about it felt alive, like it had waited patiently for someone to remember it. Riley stepped back. Her heart raced. A plane? In a barn? Out here? Alone? The tail bore faded letters. AF44 to 74522. Her breath caught. That serial number meant something official. She didn't say a word. Just walked around the frame, fingers grazing the rivets like braille. Whoever left this here didn't abandon it. They hid it, preserved it, maybe even protected it. She climbed the ladder from a collapsed scaffolding and peered into the cockpit. The seat was leather-wrapped, cracking at the seams. The controls were still there, rusted and stiff. The smell inside was oil, sweat, and time. That's when she saw them dog tags, dangling from the yoke, darkened by years but still legible. Her fingers trembled as she lifted them. Lieutenant Henry Maddox, they read. 0819436 United States Army Air Forces. Beneath that, another line. Blood type O. No religious preference. She swallowed hard. A name, a man, a ghost in the machine. Riley slid down from the cockpit, her boots crunching into the barn floor. The air felt heavier now, like history had taken shape around her. This wasn't a fixer-upper. This was a story, one someone had nearly buried. She wasn't sure why, but in that moment, she made a silent promise. She'd find out who Henry Maddox was, and she'd bring his plane back to life. The next morning, Riley arrived before the sun did. She parked her truck outside the barn, tossed her coffee thermos onto the front seat, and stepped into the musty silence like it was sacred ground. The P-51 hadn't moved, not even a shift in the way it leaned against time, but it somehow felt more awake than yesterday, more aware. She walked a slow circle around it, brushing off cobwebs with her sleeve, tracing her father's voice in the rivets. Not literally. Of course he'd never flown. But he'd loved planes like they were poetry. Before cancer made him a ghost in his own body, he used to point out aircraft flying overhead and name them like old friends. "That's a Mustang, baby," he'd say, sitting on their front porch. Fast, beautiful, and mean as hell when she needed to be. Back then, Riley hadn't cared much. She wanted motorcycles, tattoos, and to prove to every man in the shop that she could tear down a carburetor in half the time. But now, years later, with her father's ashes spread on the hill behind their old house, his voice came back in smells and textures, in the cold bite of steel, in the hum of a socket wrench, in the quiet awe of finding a warbird forgotten in a barn. She unzipped her jacket, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. Not on restoration, not yet. First came inventory. Identify. Document. Photograph. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures, starting with the nose, then the wings, then the interior. The more she saw, the more questions she had. Why was this here? Who owned the barn before Cliff? Why hadn't anyone stripped it for parts? A plane like this, even in terrible shape, would be worth something to collectors. But this one had been left untouched, almost reverently. The dog tag sat on the workbench now, still warm from her palm. Henry Maddox. The name felt carved into her. She Googled him, but nothing came up beyond archived military rosters. She tried Facebook. Nothing. Instagram. TikTok. Of course not. He was from another time. The only record she had was metal stamped and oxidized. That's when she noticed the logbook wedged under the seat. Riley climbed back into the cockpit and pulled it free. The leather cover had cracked like desert ground, but the pages inside were intact. Yellowed, fragile, and handwritten in tight, looping cursive. Flight dates. Maintenance notes. A few drawings. One of a woman in a sundress. One of a child with wild hair. On the inside cover, scrawled in pencil, was a line that stopped her cold. "If this bird ever flies again, let her carry more than just me." Riley closed the book gently, like it might disintegrate in her hands. She didn't know this man. She'd never heard his voice. But in that single sentence, she understood everything. He hadn't just loved this plane. He had lived in it, trusted it, bled in it maybe. And now, decades later, it had landed somehow, impossibly in front of her. She sat down on an overturned milk crate, staring at the fuselage in silence. She didn't believe in fate, but she believed in echoes, and this plane was full of them. She couldn't stop staring at the dog tags. They swung gently from a nail she'd driven into the beam above her workbench, catching the morning light like wind chimes in a church. The name Henry Maddox kept rolling through her head, like a radio stuck on one station. The tags weren't just identifiers. They were invitations, proof that this machine once had a heartbeat behind the stick. Riley had handled thousands of mechanical parts in her life. Cams, gears, gaskets, but none of them had ever made her palms sweat like those thin slivers of stamped metal. She wiped her hands on her jeans and returned to the Mustang's cockpit. The more she explored, the more questions piled up. Under the pilot seat was a tattered canvas pouch, sealed with an oxidized zipper. She pried it open slowly, half expecting mice. Instead, there were photographs, dozens of them, black and white, sepia-toned, some torn at the corners. One showed 3 men in flight suits standing in front of a pristine P-51, all smiles, eyes squinting against the Sunday. One of them was Maddox, younger than she imagined, maybe 22. His arms slung around the shoulder of a man with a cigarette in his teeth. Another photo showed a woman in a floral dress, holding a baby near a garden fence. No names, no dates, just ghosts with soft eyes. But tucked in the back, folded into fourths, was something else. A letter. The paper was thin and brittle, like rice paper that had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times. Riley opened it carefully. It was addressed to the next pilot. Not a family member, not a child, a pilot. She read the first few lines aloud, her voice quiet in the cavern of the barn. "If you're reading this, it means the Mustang is yours now. I hope you treat her gently, but fly her hard. She deserves that. She earned it." Riley swallowed the lump rising in her throat. The letter wasn't long, maybe 6 lines, but it landed heavy. At the bottom, it was signed in ink that had barely faded. H. Maddox. She folded it again and pressed it against her chest, just for a second. She didn't cry. Not yet. But something inside her shifted. This wasn't just a discovery anymore. It was a responsibility. She placed the letter on the workbench and snapped a photo for safekeeping. Then she took another of the plane, framing it just right nose to tail, late morning light falling across the metal like water. She didn't post it to Instagram. Not yet. She wasn't ready for people to know. She needed time to let it sink in, to figure out what this all meant. That evening, she brought dinner back to the barn, cold chicken and a gas station biscuit. She ate sitting cross-legged under the wing, staring at the fuselage like it might start whispering. The sun dipped low, and the barn filled with golden light. She reached up, tapped the metal once, and whispered, "Why me?" No answer came, but she stayed until the stars came out, just in case one did. It was 4 days later, when the truck pulled up. Riley was lying on a mechanic's mat beneath the Mustang's fuselage, trying to remove a corroded bolt from the belly panel, when she heard tires crunching gravel outside the barn. She rolled out, wiping her hands on a rag, expecting Cliff or maybe a curious local. Instead, a dusty green Ford pickup stopped just short of the entrance. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. Tall, maybe mid-70s. His spine was straight, but his steps were careful. His jacket looked military, faded olive with patches long since worn smooth. His eyes were hidden behind aviator sunglasses, and his right hand trembled ever so slightly as he tucked something into his pocket. "Riley Monroe?" he asked, voice gravel and old wind. "That's me," she replied, squinting into the sundae. He nodded once, stepped forward, and let his gaze move past her to the Mustang inside. He didn't speak for a long moment, just stared at it, not like someone admiring a relic, but like someone facing a ghost they weren't sure they were ready to see again. "I heard about the plane," he said at last. "A friend of mine saw your photo on a local aviation forum. He recognized the serial number." Riley's pulse jumped. "You knew Henry Maddox." The man removed his sunglasses. His eyes were pale gray, rimmed red. "I flew with him." The words hit like a dropped wrench. The barn fell silent, the world narrowing to just the two of them and the machine between them. "My name's Arthur Leclerc," he continued. "We served together in the 357th. Flew side by side in Europe. Maddox was my wingman." Riley stepped aside, gesturing toward the plane like she was inviting someone to church. Arthur didn't move at first. Then he walked slowly inside, his boots echoing on the concrete. He circled the Mustang once, eyes scanning every dent, every patch of rust. "She's held up better than I thought," he said softly. "You knew she was here?" Riley asked. "No," he said. "I thought she was gone forever. We lost Henry in 45. Technically MIA. But I never believed it. He was too damn stubborn to die." Riley's breath caught. "Wait, you think he survived the war?" Arthur hesitated. His hand rested on the wing. "We lost radio contact over northern Germany. He was hit. I saw smoke. I watched him dip below the clouds, but I never saw him crash. No wreckage was found. After the war, the army said he was presumed dead. His wife, Nora, she never stopped looking." Riley stepped closer, heart pounding. "There are letters, pictures, a logbook, and a note from him, addressed to the next pilot." Arthur looked like someone had punched the air out of him. He turned away, pulling something from his jacket, a small leather-bound notebook. He handed it to her without a word. Inside were notes. Names, maps. One page marked, "Possible location, Barn, NW of Pine Hollow." He was trying to come home, Arthur whispered. And maybe he did. The notebook stayed on Riley's nightstand that night, unopened. Not because she was afraid to read it, but because something told her it deserved the morning. So when the sun crept through the slats of her barn's eastern wall and painted the Mustang in soft gold, she finally picked it up again. The pages inside were dated between 1984 and 2001, all in the same steady handwriting. Arthur Leclerc's. He had spent nearly 2 decades chasing rumors, writing letters to old squad mates, cross-referencing crash reports, and pinning yarn on corkboards in a trailer somewhere in the Georgia woods. There were copies of missing aircrew reports, clippings from warbird enthusiast newsletters. One note simply read, "No one buries a Mustang like that, unless they're hiding it." That morning, Riley made coffee, lit the heater, and returned to the barn with fresh eyes. She stood in front of the Mustang and whispered, "You weren't just lost, were you? You were hidden." The plane said nothing, of course, but something about the silence felt more cooperative now, like trust was forming between them. She decided to look deeper. The belly panel finally gave after 30 minutes of wrestling, revealing a dusty compartment filled with hay, rust flakes, and something square wrapped in wax paper. Riley reached in and pulled it out carefully. It was a tin box, maybe once a lunch container sealed shut with twine. Her hand shook as she untied it. Inside were 2 things, a bundle of envelopes and a locket. The letters were yellowed, the ink faded, but the handwriting was beautiful. Cursive, the kind that flowed like music. The return address was always the same. Nora Maddox, 12 Hamilton Road, Macon, GA, and each one began with the same salutation. "To my Henry in the sky, M." Riley sat cross-legged on the cold floor and read the first letter. It was dated March 1946, nearly a year after Henry disappeared. Nora wrote about planting tulips in the garden, fixing the mailbox he'd always hated, and how their daughter, little Joni, was asking about him more and more. "I told her you're flying missions for the stars now," the letter said. "She drew a picture of you in a rocket ship and taped it to the window. Says that way you'll know how to come home." Riley didn't mean to cry, but there was something about the softness of the words, the waiting stitched into every sentence, that cracked her open. She read the next one, then the next. Each letter spanning months, then years. Nora never stopped writing, even when the return address changed, even when the tone shifted from hopeful to heavy. Her final letter, dated 1972, simply said, "I forgive you. I hope wherever you are, you're warm. I hope the plane didn't take you too far from yourself." Riley pressed the envelope to her chest. This wasn't just history. It was heartbreak carefully folded, and someone had trusted the sky to keep it safe. She didn't touch the Mustang for 3 days. Not out of fear, but reverence. You don't tear into something sacred without listening first. Riley spent those days rereading Nora's letters and Arthur's notes, trying to understand not just the man, but the silence he left behind. The Mustang was no longer just a restoration project. It was a puzzle box built out of grief, duty, and the things men never said out loud. Every bolt felt like it belonged to someone else's memory, and Riley wasn't sure she had the right to unscrew it. On the 4th morning, she rolled up the barn doors and let the light pour in like a baptism. She wheeled over her tool cart and stood in front of the plane like she was asking permission. Then, slowly, methodically, she began. The first task was disassembly, carefully removing panels, cataloging each piece, documenting the state of the airframe. Most of the engine was gone, but the skeleton remained a Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650, or at least its rusted remains. The wiring was shot, the hydraulics, toast. But the bones were good. And Riley knew enough about machines to know that sometimes bones were all you needed. Word started to spread, not because she told anyone, but because small towns don't keep secrets when something this big wakes up. First came Pete Langley, the 60-something retired mechanic from town, with a bag of old tools and a quiet offer to help. "Used to work on crop dusters back in the day," he said. "Figured this ain't too different." Then came Marisol from the high school shop class, a senior with a shaved head, chipped black nail polish, and welding goggles perpetually hanging around her neck. "My grandpa flew in the Pacific," she said. "You got room for one more?" By the end of the week, the barn was alive again. Not loud, no engines yet, but busy, focused, sacred. They worked like monks restoring a forgotten cathedral, brushing corrosion from aluminum, rewiring gauges, sanding down years. And all the while, Riley led quietly, not as a boss but as a steward. She didn't bark orders. She asked questions, listened, trusted people to bring their own reverence to the project. One afternoon, Arthur Leclerc came back with a folder of flight manuals, photographs, and a hand-drawn schematic from memory of how Henry had modified the instrument panel. "He had big plans," Arthur said, tapping the paper. "Said he was going to fly her to every airfield west of the Mississippi. Said the war didn't take his freedom, it just delayed it." That night, Riley stayed late, alone in the barn, staring at the fuselage lit by a single dangling bulb. Her hands were raw, her heart even more so. She looked up at the dog tag swaying above her workbench and whispered, "We're not just fixing a plane, are we?" And the Mustang, silent and still, somehow said no. They were rebuilding a story the world had nearly forgotten to finish. The Mustang's fuselage was stripped to bare metal by mid-March. Every patch of corrosion scraped clean, every rivet inspected, every memory held to the light like glass. Riley worked with calloused hands and quieter thoughts. Something had shifted inside her. She no longer felt like she was fixing someone else's dream. She felt like she was being invited into it. And when Arthur brought over a box labeled, "Henry's Flight Logs Do Not Toss," the invitation felt official. The box had been stored in Arthur's attic since 1978. Inside were 8 spiral notebooks and 1 leather journal with Henry's initials pressed into the cover. The leather had darkened with age, but the pages inside were legible. The first few were familiar maintenance records, fuel costs, weather notes. But deeper in the journal, Riley found something else. Drawings. Full-page sketches of the P-51 painted in different schemes. Notes on long-distance flights. Checklists for modifications, and a heading written in ink so bold it bled into the next page. Dream Flights. There were entries beneath it. Flight 1. Macon to Santa Fe Sunrise Departure. Flight 2. Glacier Park Overflight Low Pass for Joni. Flight 3. Catalina Sunset Run with Nora, if she'll come. Each destination had a date penciled beside it all from the summer of 1946. All dreams that never happened. Riley's hands trembled as she turned the page. There, folded into the back cover, was a note in different handwriting. Nora's. She recognized the cursive from the letters. It simply read, "If you find this, I hope you make one of them real. For him, for me, for Joni." Riley sat down hard on the barn floor, heart pounding in her ears. This wasn't just about restoration anymore. It was a request, a final wish tucked between oil-stained paper and the weight of a family's silence. She stared at the Mustang, still partially disassembled, its nose cone resting on sawhorses, its wings stripped of flaking paint. "You were supposed to fly again," she whispered. "Weren't you?" That night, Riley called her mom for the first time in weeks. They didn't talk about much, just weather and rent and whether Riley had finally bought new tires for her truck. But toward the end, her mother asked quietly, "What's got you sounding different lately?" Riley hesitated, then said, "I think I'm building something that matters." Her mom paused. "That sounds like your father," and for the first time in a long while, Riley smiled at the sound of his name. After the call, she climbed into the cockpit, now partially restored, the seat covered with a fresh sheet of canvas, the yoke wiped clean and reconnected. She placed the leather journal on the seat beside her and stared out through the dusty canopy. The barn was dark, except for the soft glow of a single utility light above her. "I don't know how yet," she whispered, "but I'm going to finish what you started." And outside, under the moonlight, the wind rustled the wheat like applause. The package arrived without a return address. Just Riley's name, written in block letters, taped to a plain brown box left on the front seat of her truck. At first, She thought it was a mistake, maybe a part order someone dropped off early. But when she peeled back the tape and opened the lid, her breath caught. Inside was a shadow box, carefully arranged, sacred almost. At the center was a purple heart, the real kind, not a replica. Beside it, a black and white photo of 3 smiling pilots in flight jackets, standing in front of a pristine P-51 Mustang. Henry was in the middle, Arthur on the right. The third man, unnamed until now, had a note clipped to the back of the frame. Captain Samuel Eldridge, Kaya, 1,945. And there, folded into a tight square behind the metal, was a letter. Riley unfolded it slowly, afraid it might crumble in her hands. The paper was thick, almost parchment. The ink, blue and firm. The handwriting was unmistakably Arthur's. Riley, I thought about whether to give this to you. I've held on to it for years, not knowing if it should be buried, displayed, or forgotten. But now, watching what you've done, what you've brought back, I believe you're the one who should have it. This was Henry's, found in a care package Nora sent to the airfield weeks before he vanished. He never got to wear the medal, but maybe it's time someone finished the part of his story that didn't make it home. If you ever finish that Mustang, and I believe you will, I want you to do one thing for me. Take it to Macon. Fly it low over the Maddox family cemetery. There's a patch of open sky above their plot. Nora always said she wanted to hear the sound of his engine again, just once. Even if she can't hear it anymore, I like to think the wind might carry it to her anyway. Arthur. Riley closed the letter and sat in silence, the barn dark and still around her. She placed the shadow box gently on her workbench, next to the logbook and the dog tags. She stared at it like it was an altar, a shrine built not of marble and stained glass, but grease, rust, and grief. She didn't know how to fly. She'd never sat in a P-51 outside of this barn. But somehow, none of that mattered anymore, because this wasn't about her skills. It was about his story. And hers now. They were bound, riveted together like skin to fuselage. She picked up the photo and traced Henry's smile with her thumb. I'll get her in the air, she whispered, even if it takes me the rest of my life. And somewhere between the wood beams and metal panels, the silence almost seemed to answer. Then let's finish this together. It took 5 more months. 5 months of early mornings, scraped knuckles, borrowed parts, and long nights with open blueprints and aching wrists. Riley had never rebuilt a plane before, not like this, but piece by piece, the Mustang came back to life. The fuselage gleamed in a coat of metallic silver, the nose ring painted deep red, like the original flight photos showed. They called it the ghost mare, a nod to both its spirit and its impossible survival. But for Riley, it was just his plane. Henry's. Hers now. And somehow, both. Word had spread far beyond their county by then. Aviation blogs picked up the story. A few old veterans drove down just to touch the wing. Local news ran a piece, calling it the barn find that brought a hero home. But none of it felt real until the morning of the airshow. The tarmac at Dobbins Air Reserve Base was already packed when they arrived, towing the Mustang behind Riley's rebuilt flatbed. Veterans in folding chairs, kids with foam gliders, couples holding hands beneath the Georgia Sunday, and in the middle of it all, the one hangar they had reserved, not for a display, but for final checks. Arthur Leclerc stood at the nose cone, one hand steadying himself on a cane, the other pressed flat against the cowling like he was saying goodbye for the last time. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Riley stood beside him in a borrowed flight suit, her boots too new, her voice caught in her throat. I never flew her, she said softly. Not really. I don't even know if I can. Arthur finally looked at her, eyes pale and glassy. Then you'll learn. The pre-flight checks were meticulous. Oil pressure, hydraulic lines, rudder movement, every nut torqued, every system double-checked. A retired airman named Hank, who had worked P-51 maintenance in the 60 seconds, offered to ride co-pilot in a nearby trainer aircraft for backup. Riley nodded, her hands shaking. She climbed into the cockpit, the canopy open, The seat leather new but scuffed, just enough to feel honest. She ran her fingers across the yoke, the throttle, the old dog tags now clipped beside the radio panel. Everything inside her screamed not to do it, and everything deeper whispered that she must. The engine coughed, then caught, and the crowd, all noise until then, fell completely silent. The ghost mare taxied slowly to the runway. Riley's breath came in short bursts, her headset crackling with guidance from the tower, and Hank in the trainer beside her. The throttle moved like it belonged to her hand. The yoke felt like it remembered her grip, and when she pushed forward, the plane surged like it had been waiting decades for this moment. The wheels lifted, the sky opened, and Henry Maddox's plane finally flew again. Riley didn't cry until the flyover, until she banked gently over Macon and saw the cemetery field below. The crowd watching, the old flag waving, the wind carrying the sound of the Merlin engine like a hymn. She dipped the wings, once, then twice, and somewhere, in a place beyond words, she swore she felt him smile. The flight didn't last long. 15 minutes, maybe 20. But time bends when you're flying someone else's dream. When Riley landed the P-51 and taxied back to the hangar, her legs were shaking, her cheeks soaked with tears she hadn't realized had fallen. The crowd erupted the moment the canopy lifted. But the sound was distant, muffled, like a memory from underwater. All she could hear was the hum of the Merlin engine, echoing in her bones. Arthur was waiting at the hangar, standing taller than he had in weeks. He didn't say anything as she climbed down, helmet in hand, suit still dusted with old barn grit. He just reached out and placed something in her palm. A folded photo. The same one from the shadow box, Henry, Arthur, and Captain Eldridge. But on the back, Arthur had written 3 new words in block print. You brought him home. After the air show, she was offered interviews, a documentary, even a seat on a panel at the Smithsonian. She declined most of them, not out of shyness, but because some stories aren't meant for cameras. Some legacies are best honored in grease-stained journals and quiet runways, not press junkets. Instead, she went home, back to the barn, back to the ghosts. The Mustang now sat under proper cover, polished and proud. A rotating team of volunteers helped maintain her, many of whom had been there from the beginning. Pete, Marisol, even Hank, who taught her to fine-tune every inch of the power plant. And Arthur, when he could, came by just to sit in silence and stare. But Riley had changed too. She wasn't just the girl who turned wrenches to forget. She was the keeper of a skybound memory, a living archive of love, duty, and unfinished journeys. She started offering workshops not for planes, but for women in trades. She called it Flight School for the Grounded, a nod to every soul who'd been told they weren't enough, weren't capable, weren't welcome under the hood. One afternoon, she received a letter in the mail. No return address, just a note inside, written in soft cursive. You never knew me. I'm Joni Henry and Nora's daughter. I watched your flyover from the cemetery. My mother always said he'd come back one day. I think he did. Thank you. You gave my father his sky again. Riley didn't respond with words. She folded the letter and placed it next to the dog tags and the journal in the small glass display she kept in the corner of the barn. She stared at it for a while, the way you do when something finally settles in your heart. That evening, long after everyone had gone home, she wheeled the Mustang out beneath a wide pink-orange sky. She didn't start the engine. She didn't climb in. She just stood beside the wing and rested her palm on the cool metal. You're more than a machine, she whispered. You're proof that stories don't die. They just wait for someone brave enough to carry them. And above her, the wind curled through the wheat fields, like an echo. Not the end, just the next takeoff.